announcements before we get started. Cynthia has her new book and some of her other books back there. And so if anyone is interested in the Chicago and Western Indiana Railroad, they can get this. Lincoln Highway, Calumet River.
The South Shore Railroad.
The South Shore Railroad. So, anyway, I know she's been doing a lot of research. You're working on the one on Hagwish, right?
Right,
So
but
is that your next?
it won't be an Arcadia book, it'll be a regular,
Oh,
you'll have to read.
Oh, okay, so it's just not all
Very
pictures?
few pictures.
Okay. So anyway, so it's good if people write books, I encourage them to bring it in and to show others. Also have latest news release on our research summit that's going to be held here Friday in room 200, and we've got 20 panelists and about 3 or 4 speakers that will be at the summit. We have a panel in the morning and a panel in the afternoon. So if anyone's interested in getting more details, this information's up here.
It's 2 pages. If you just picked up the first one, there's a second page here as well.
And so just Dr. Pennington and I would like to welcome you to the third session in the third year. This is our third year of doing it. And I want to make sure everybody signs in because we've got a grant from Indiana Humanities, and they want to know who shows up. And I keep telling them, oh, about 50, and they said, no, we need the names. So if everybody signs in, that would be great. Last time we had 41, and that was because a couple, at least one class came in and participated. This evening's speaker is going to be Dr. Stotz. Dr. Stotz works at the Field Museum. He got his PhD in evolutionary biology from the University of Chicago in 1990. He is active in programs to preserve biological diversity and threatened habitats, both in the Chicago region and in other countries. Most of the other countries are in South America, but I know you went to China once. So in Chicago, he focuses his attention on studying bird migration and the effects of climate change on bird populations. And today's weather could probably be described as a result of climate change as well. He is co-chair of the Climate Change Task Force for Chicago Wilderness, whose Congress is tomorrow night, I think. All day tomorrow, yeah, it's an all day event. So he's, as part of the Field Museum's Tropical Rapid Biological Inventory teams, he has participated in more than 25 inventories in Peru, Ecuador, Bolivia, and Cuba, as well as China. He's author of 2 books, Birds of Peru. This is a landmark field guide to the more than 1,800 species of birds in Peru. And Neotropical Birds, Ecology and Conservation, which provides information on the distribution and ecological patterns of more than 4,000 Latin American birds, and uses this information to analyze conservation priorities. He has been surveying birds in the Calumet region since the mid-1990s, and I know he's been that because I've seen him on occasion out monitoring birds. He is currently working with Audubon, Great Lakes, and Calumet landowners to develop a plan for the conservation of declining wetland birds in the region. And that is, if you want to learn more about the Audubon, Great Lakes, and Calumet project, it's headed by Matt Miller of Audubon, and he'll be one of the panelists at Friday's Research Summit. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Stotz.
Thanks. Okay, let's see. So this is that's probably the best. Let's do the front. Yeah. That's better. This is an update of a talk that I've been giving since the early 2000s. And so this is a picture of Big Marsh in southeast Chicago, which doesn't look like this anymore because they got rid of the Phragmites. Gone away. Does this do anything? Okay. Well,
Take your figure.
all right. So I'm in Indiana.
You
No,
go.
that does not do it.
That's it.
Okay, so I'm in Indiana, so the first thing I do is apologize for my Illinois bias. I think mostly about Illinois. I recognize the importance of Northwest Indiana in terms of avifauna in this region, but I am very Illinois focused. So we'll go quickly through what's in the Calumet avifauna. We'll think about the conservation of water birds, conservation of land birds, and we'll focus on migratory stopover sites. Talk about threats to the avifauna and focus particularly on invasive species, and then we'll talk about marsh breeding birds, and I'll give my quick take on the project that Matt Miller can tell you a lot more about. Okay, so in terms of the Calumet avifauna, a big piece of this is we're a very important region for migrants, waterfowl, shorebirds, and land birds, especially in woodlands. So a big part of what makes this region important is this migration that comes through. There are some breeding species where we make some difference. Marsh breeders are probably the most important of these. There are some important species that nest in colonies. Herons are probably a positive. Gulls, not everybody would view as a positive. And then some woodland breeders, especially if you include dunes as part of the region. Okay, so this represents some of these different groups. So we have black-crowned night heron here. They're big populations still breeding in the Indiana part. The Illinois population is no longer breeding in Calumet. It's sort of split. Some of it went into Indiana and some of it went up to Lincoln Park, of all places. Gadwall is one of the migrant waterfowl that come through here and occasionally actually breeds in the wetlands around here. Bluebirds are in the woodlands. We don't really have forest so much here. It's more open, and birds like bluebirds take advantage of it. Golden-winged warbler is an important migrant, so they don't breed here. They pass through here during migration, but the northern part of Indiana and the Chicago area is a hugely important stopover area for this species. Most of the breeding population is in Wisconsin and Minnesota, and they pass through here. And so we really matter to this species as a stopover site. Tree swallow, this is an adult not being swallowed by its young, but feeding its young. And it's here basically because one of the issues in the Calumet region is the ecotoxicology. How bad is the contamination and what's happening to the birds? And one of the most important studies has been done on tree swallows. Indigo bunting, because it's pretty, and great blue heron to represent the importance of the wetlands here for foraging birds. Okay, so conservation issues for water birds. The biggest points here is the water levels. In much of the region, it's either too high, too low, or both. So we've had real problems maintaining populations of water birds because in a lot of places we don't have any control over the water levels. We have isolated wetlands that have issues that that cause us to have problems with those water levels. One of the things that we're looking to do is get control over water levels. Pollution is an important potential problem. The two big studies that I'm aware of are on tree swallow and black-crowned night heron. And in tree swallow, or in black-crowned night heron, it looks like even though they're top of the line fish eaters, which are things that are most at risk, you don't see really elevated levels of pollutants in their system. And I think the big reason for that is they don't really stay put in Calumet to forage. So they move broadly through both northern Indiana and the Chicago area, and then come back to feed their young here, but they're getting fish from other places in Calumet. On tree swallow, it's actually a fairly interesting study. They looked at them in the Big Marsh area and in Powderhorn. And what I would say the take-home message was that in the Big Marsh area, they looked at mercury, and what they found was they came back with high levels of mercury, not enough to be toxic, but high levels. And during the breeding season, they maintained those high levels, but they didn't go any higher. In Powderhorn, their levels of mercury actually went down. And so what that's indicating is they're getting worse mercury inputs during the winter than they are during the breeding season in Calumet and in Powderhorn. Powderhorn is relatively clean water. It's not really tied into the industrial complex, but that's saying they're not in very good places in the winter. And I think part of that is a lot of the water in the eastern United States has issues with mercury. Invasive plants are a huge issue, both plants, or invasive species, both plants and aquatic organisms. We'll come back to invasive species in a bit. Okay, so in water birds, marsh breeding birds are sort of at the top of this. That's where we have the most threatened species. I say losing bit by bit. It actually is worse than that. We'll come back to this. Migrant waterfowl, this is an important region in the Chicago area. Not that many places have more waterfowl than you have in the Calumet region, but thinking globally, it's relatively unimportant. I won't use it, but. Migrant shorebirds, we can be important. The issue is lack of habitat. In some years when water levels are right, there can be a lot of birds, but often water levels are not right. Among the colony species, among the herons, there are some threatened species that are part of this: black-crowned night heron, little blue, yellow-crowned night heron, least bittern. But right now, the populations are fairly low because of the fact that conditions have been pretty poor for a long time. And then we have big populations of gulls nesting in the Calumet region, both in Indiana and in Illinois. And so they're considered a nuisance species that people are looking at how to control those numbers. So the gulls love it, but not everybody loves gulls. Okay, in terms of land birds, the big issues are habitat fragmentation, where what we've got here is small patches of habitat, except for the dunes. But in the rest of the Calumet region, we're looking mostly at patches that are too small to maintain all the breeding species that you might expect. The other thing is these small patches are more at risk for threats from the outside. So the fact they're little means that if you've got things like predators outside that come into those woodlands, you get more issues from that. You'll have more problems from pollution. So these small patches are under a lot more risk. And it turns out the birds in these small patches have a low breeding success. So for land birds, for the most part, again, except for the main part of the dunes, we're not very important for breeding because of the low breeding success. And then finally, we have big issues in terms of invasive species in this area, and a lot of our woodland areas are not effectively managed, although that's improving. Okay, so in terms of what is in this area, Migrants are a big component, as I already mentioned. We have both short distance migrants like the field sparrow on the upper left. So field sparrows go to the southeast US. And then we have neotropical migrants like these three here. Blackburnians go to the Andes. Rose-breasted grosbeak goes to southern Central America, and then blue-winged warbler breeds or winters in Mexico primarily. In terms of breeding species, I've got dickcissel up there because it is in some of the grasslands around here, and it is a species that's showing declines. So the fact of it being here is potentially important. But there just isn't a lot of habitat for grassland birds here. In terms of migratory stopovers, which I think is where the Calumet region is most important, even considering the dunes where there are breeding populations of some woodland things, the most important feature here is we are a very important place for migratory stopover of land birds. And essentially, think about the geography of these areas. It's hard to imagine, but northwestern Indiana and Chicago for migratory birds are a great place after what they've crossed, because in both Indiana and Illinois, from the southern part of the state until you get up here, it's mostly unbroken corn, except for the places that are soybeans. So they need a place to stop. And in the Chicago area, there aren't very many places. So think about what the Calumet region looks like. There's a lot of residential, there's a lot of industry, and these small patches of habitat. Those small patches we refer to as fire escapes. They're small and isolated and a few resources, but they can be really crucial when birds arrive. They need a place to stop and recover before they can move on. Then we talk, so these are pictures from Wisconsin, but here you can see it's basically all ag, and then there's this little patch here that's a fire escape, and we have sort of similar things. Convenience stores are bigger, but they're still fairly small patches that are in inhospitable habitat. And then finally, we have what they call full-service hotels, which are extensive areas of woodland habitat. When we think about the Calumet region, there are a lot of fire escapes. Examples of this are the Hammond Bird Sanctuary, which is a little area of crap right on the lakefront that the birds that are migrating hit and love to take advantage of. The woods around Wolf Lake sort of fall into this category. They're fairly small. They're not really high-quality woods, but those trees can fill up with migrants when conditions are right. But there aren't enough resources for them to maintain themselves. Someplace like Calumet Park, again, it's mostly ball diamonds and tennis courts, but the trees that are there could be really important. Convenience stores are places like Eggers Woods, which is actually a pretty nice wooded area, high quality woods, but it's not very big. So it's not something where the birds can really recover very well. Pegwish Marsh sort of falls into the same category. These all kind of run together. Whether we really have a full service hotel is a question. The most closest to that would be the Indiana Dunes, especially at the east end where you have a big area of intact woods kind of around the state park. And it's a place where if birds get in there, they can get enough resources that they can actually put on fat to make the move going north. So fire escapes in some respects are low importance, but if you need something and this is all you have, it's really crucial. I mean, think about one of the things that happens with the lake is these land birds get out of the lake, they come streaming in, and they need a place to settle. And those lakefront parks, no matter how crappy they are someplace they can get into. Okay, so one of the things that when we're talking about lakefront, about migratory stopovers around here, is it makes a difference how close you are to Lake Michigan. And so those places right on the lake have a different set of birds. They're much more affected by what the weather is on a particular day. As you get farther inland, the movement patterns are less weather affected, and it's a different suite of birds. So Ken Brock, who's done a lot of work on the Indiana side, talks about how many records there are for the lakefront versus these inland sites that aren't very far inland. So someplace like Wolf Lake is more like an inland site than it is like a lakefront site and the sort of birds that are there, even though it's only a few miles from the lakefront. Okay? In the western part of this region, in Lake County and in Cook County, essentially any green space is potentially important, even if it's not very good. And I think Hammond Bird Sanctuary is an example of that. That is really, yeah.
How about stuff like Shabona Woods and all that wooded area along the expressway by like 130th and through there?
I mean, what I'd say on that is those are potentially important given the right sort of weather conditions. It's not someplace that's high enough quality to hold birds for very long, but it's a place the birds can settle, rest a little bit, get a little bit of food before they move on. I mean, this is something we see in these lakefront, like in these lakefront areas, which is what I know better, is at dawn, all these birds are streaming in, they find it, they settle, they relax for a little bit, but then 2 or 3 hours later, they start moving to someplace that has more resources. So I think that's basically what you find there is a sort of short-term response there, but they can't get enough resources to make it someplace they can spend a long time. Yeah.
Are there any migratory birds going through the region right now?
Yeah, fall migration is drawing to a close. We're past the main part, but there's still migratory movement basically for the next month of land birds. You know, waterfowl haven't really hit yet. They're still to come. But the land birds, you know, warblers are gone. Most of the sparrows are gone, but there's still other things. So I was out on the Chicago lakefront today, and there are long spurs migrating. There are tree sparrows. There's the tail end of the various sparrows. So there's still some, but we're past the main part. September, October is the big part. And then that leads us right into the fact that spring is a lot more crucial than fall. And there are 3 things that play a big role in this. One is the weather conditions are worse. So here it is, the 1st of November. I mean, this is ridiculously warm for the 1st of November. But on average, the kind of equivalent months in the fall average about 4 degrees warmer than the equivalent months in the spring. So October is about 4 degrees warmer than April. And that makes a big difference in terms of insect abundance. And the other thing is, in the spring, all the resources are just now being created. So when these come out, that's the first greenery there's been. Now you go out and you've got all of this stuff that's built up during the summer. So there's a huge amount of resources present. In the spring, it's relatively small. And then in the spring, Lake Michigan is more of a barrier for these birds coming north. And so you get things along the Indiana part of the lakefront where you get these longshore migrations. They're basically a spring phenomenon in the land birds. Where they arrive, they don't want to cross the lake, and so they spread out into the green space that's near the lake. Okay, so spring is a more important month, a more important time than fall. Yeah.
I didn't catch that. What's the last point? Lake Michigan is more of a barrier?
Lake Michigan, so when the birds are migrating north, they come up to the lake and they don't want to cross it. So they pile up against the lake and then spread out around.
Whereas in the fall,
they're basically, they can move
leaving
past
away.
it. I mean, there's still some of that in the fall, depending on what the weather conditions are. But in the spring, it's a much bigger phenomenon. And the Indiana part that's especially true. So I bring this up, and one of the things I would say is in terms of thinking about restoration activities, if you're paying attention to birds, what you're really looking for is creating good conditions in the spring, less thinking about creating good conditions in the fall, because the conditions in the fall will be good already. What that means is one of the big things here near Lake Michigan is thinking about having things that are leafing out all throughout the spring period, because we also have the effect, and you all get it more than we get in Chicago, thank God. The lake effect breezes and the snows and things that affect here, it makes spring is is later right along the lake than it is as you get farther inland because of those lake breezes. And so the vegetation could be well behind the birds in the spring if you, and depending on what the weather's like. So you want to have things that are leafing out all throughout that period. That's when the insects are most abundant on the trees, is right at leaf out. Okay, so in Calumet across the time we've lost a number of species. So these are all species that used to breed in the Calumet region and no longer do. The one that lasted the longest was upland sandpiper. The last breeding records were in southeastern southeastern Chicago in the 1960s. Piping plover went extinct about World War II. Black tern went extinct in the 50s. And the common sparrow didn't even make it to the 1900s. Then we have a number of threatened birds, and this shows how long I've been doing this talk, is that basically all these birds are effectively gone right now from Calumet. So black-crowned night heron, there's a nesting colony at Arsler Middle, but the big population that was in the marshes in Illinois is gone. Yellowheaded Blackbird has completely disappeared from the Illinois side. I was talking to somebody about the fact there's still one at Grant Street Marsh, but basically this is effectively gone. Least bittern, common gallinule, and piebald grebes did not breed in Illinois for 3 years. Now with some restoration work, they're starting to come back. We'll come back to this, but there are important birds that we matter for. There are other things that are at risk. I don't care about these. I'm just pretending that I do. But there are other things in the Calumet region besides birds, so I hear anyway. Okay, the main threats, there are 4 big things. Pollution, development, which relates to the habitat fragmentation, how badly disrupted the hydrology is in invasive species, and so this one photo shows all of that. So we have purple loosestrife, and those are Phragmites. We have remnant industrial back there, and you can see that may not even be pollution, but we'll pretend that it is. And also the development, and then the disrupted hydrology. You can't really see this, but it doesn't look the way a wetland ought to look because the water levels are not being maintained properly. In terms of pollution, for birds, this is mostly not a huge issue. It relates more to human health and relates to all the other things that are going on. As I said, the ecotoxicology suggests that although there's contamination out here, it's not at the level that is causing problems for most bird populations. The thing you want to look for is in things like the breeding ospreys that are here now, whether they start having problems, because that would be a suggestion that there is something going on. Invasive species, we've got all sorts of things. So starlings are a problem for hole nesting birds in the woodlands. Purple loosestrife, so this is from Indian Ridge Marsh before the beetles. Purple loosestrife right now is sort of at a low, but I see its numbers coming up in places that have basically been gotten rid of. Buckthorn is an issue in most of our woodlands here. And I love this picture of brown goby and invasive fish eating zebra mussels and invasive mussel. And each of those have effects. So these relate more to what's going on in the aquatic system. I would say the invasive species are more of an issue in the aquatic systems than they are in the terrestrial systems down here, but they're hidden underground, or underwater. Hydrology has been altered in a lot of places, so the factor beavers in the Calumet region is a great thing, but because the hydrology is so badly altered, when beavers do this, they screw everything up. So it's a double-edged sword. It's great there are beavers here, it's horrible that there are beavers here. One of the things with this altered hydrology is it ties in with the invasive species, so all these Phragmites. Phragmites love what we've done to the hydrology. It creates conditions that allow them to go in. The salt that is in the system, they like too, and it all sort of ties together. But ultra-hydrology is probably the biggest single issue currently in our wetlands. Of course, the fact of development, this picture is from Schaumburg, not from Calumet, but it's the same sort of thing. All this development and our protected areas are isolated within that. And that plays a big role for birds. The small protected areas can't maintain all the species that a large protected area would. Okay, so in terms of invasive species, there are different species that are affecting different habitats, so it's not one size fits all. If you just get rid of Phragmites, we'd be set. Or if we could cut out the buckthorn, our woodlands would be in great shape. There just is a lot going on, and the effects are different in all these things. In the wetlands, you've got a huge array of aquatic animals that disrupt the ecosystem there. And there are things that are basically, their effects are on the habitat. The big one there is carp. So if you get carp in the systems, they interfere with the establishment of aquatic vegetation. And so someplace like Big Marsh, which is got all sorts of problems, the thing that really killed it was the carp, because what it did was it meant the aquatic vegetation just retreated from the water entirely, and so the wetland birds no longer use that area. Aquatic invasive plants are something that are potentially an issue that we don't know very much about. So this is the stuff that's under the water column. So if you go to Eggers Woods, where the water looks fine, there's no carp in there, and you think everything's fine. Well, the dominant plant under that water is Eurasian milfoil, which entirely changes the environment for the invertebrates that live there that the birds would be feeding on. And so I think part of what's affected it is the fact of the invasive Eurasian milfoil. And we have the issues. So this is talking about things like purple loosestrife and Phragmites, which is the big one now. They've changed the nature of the habitats around these wetlands and made them much less usable by birds and other creatures. Yeah.
You've mentioned Big Marsh on several occasions.
Yeah.
Where is Big Marsh?
Big Marsh, everybody knows where Big Marsh is. It's right here. So Big Marsh is in Illinois. It's along Stony Island at 122nd. So if you go Torrance, does Torrance mean anything to you? If you go up Torrance, you cross over the Calumet River. The first light is 122nd. Go west, and Big Marsh, it's right on the east side of Lake Calumet, and it's on the north side there. It's a pretty big area. It's now in the hands, it was in the hands of water or waste management for a number of years. They tried to leverage it into new landfills, but they didn't, and now it's in the hands of the Chicago Park District, and the Chicago Park District, in its infinite wisdom, has decided to put a bike park there at the south end on what's flagged. How that will interact with the potential for restoring the wetland to a high-quality wetland, we'll see. But at one time, it was one of the premier spots for wetland birds in the Chicago region. And that was when I first started coming down here in the mid-90s. It was still very good, and it hasn't been for about a decade. Hopefully, we'll see how the restoration goes and how it interacts with that bike park. Okay, problem invasives and wetlands. We've got Phragmites. So as a bird person, I think cattails are a good thing. The problem is we don't have the native species anymore. It's almost all this hybrid, which is much more aggressive. And so the birds still like it as a structure. The problem is it's much more aggressive and tends to fill in much more rapidly. Purple loosestrife is something that right now is fairly minor, but I am concerned that it could resurrect itself. And then I mentioned the Eurasian milfoil. This is that, the plant that's in the water instead of various pond weeds. In terms of animals, we mentioned common carp, the disruption of the plant communities. It also muddies the water, meaning that not as much light gets down. Zebra mussels do the opposite. It clears the water colony, but it smothers other mollusks, and clearing the water column is not necessarily a positive. And then we got round gobies that are competing with native fish, and there are a whole bunch of other things that are out there that cause problems. We still haven't come to terms completely with the issue of bilge water on the seagoing vessels that bring in these Eurasian species. So this is showing a little bit how old this is. I'm talking about zebra mussels because after zebra mussels came in a second species called quagga mussels. And for the most part, quagga mussels are the dominant invasive mussel now in Lake Michigan, and they actually have a little bit different ecology where they're more of an issue than zebra mussels. So life goes on. Okay, in terms of the effects on birds, it changes the structure of the wetland vegetation, which is a huge factor. You know, a diverse wetland community with cattails and sedges and so on can have a lot of birds in it. When it turns to pure Phragmites, you lose almost everything. A big part of that is having appropriate nesting structures for them, but also these non-native species have fewer insects. So the things that are foraging on insects that are above the water column, it makes a difference. Carp and zebra mussels are decreasing habitat diversity and the aquatic vegetation that's available. And then some invasive fish are actually an important food supply for the fish-eating birds. For the most part, a heron doesn't care what the fish is. It's more about how big the fish is. So they'll eat round gobies. They're perfectly happy with that. It's just as good as yellow perch, I guess. But we'd be better off in general with the native fish. And there are some aspects about where those fish spend their time that make them more or less available to the fish-eating birds. In terrestrial habitats, there are a variety of invasive species. Some things are so well established that we sort of don't recognize that they're invasives. So earthworms are a good example of that. All those earthworms that you're happy to have in your garden are non-native, and they change. They're all through our woodlands, and they change the ecology of the soil in those woodlands and make it more hospitable to buckthorn and less hospitable to our native species. Honeybees are just, I don't want to say bad things about honeybees, but the focus on them when people talk about bees is misplaced. What we really should be focusing on is native bees. Invasive species alter the structure of the habitat. So woodlands, it's mostly the shrubs and herbaceous plants, so things like honeysuckles and buckthorn are big. Things like garlic mustard. The herbaceous plants that are native here can be a really crucial food supply. But when it gets replaced by things like garlic mustard, it's no longer very useful, and then the buckthorn and honeysuckle shade them out, and so you lose that. In grassland areas, it's mostly woody shrubs that we worry about, although there are some bad herbaceous species. And down here, honeysuckle and especially buckthorn have really moved into a lot of these grassland areas. I think I just said this. So what it's done to the birds is the dense understory is better for forest birds, but our woodland communities are mostly things that like it more open, and so most of those species do worse. So there is a trade-off. There's certain species that if you've got like a buckthorn invasion, you've got species that you wouldn't get in the more open woods, but you'll lose the species like open woods. So things like Wood thrush and hooded warblers will come into places with a lot of shrubs, but you'll lose things like red-headed woodpecker and gray-crested flycatcher. In grasslands, for the most part, you're losing the grassland species that we care about, things like dick thistles, henslow sparrows, bobolinks, those sorts of things, when you get more shrubs. And buckthorn and honeysuckle are an important food supply for things in winter. So these interact with climate change to mean that frugivorous birds that used to go south of us spend the winter here in much bigger numbers. They feed on buckthorn and honeysuckle, and spread buckthorn and honeysuckle around. So there's a positive feedback loop there that's mediated in part by climate change. So things like robins, they become much more common in winter than they were 30 years ago. And you can see this is Christmas count data. So eastern bluebird, which is a great bird, and I'm really happy we have more of them in the winter. So this is looking at from 1970 in Illinois to 2006, shows how long ago I did this, but the pattern looks pretty much the same. Bluebirds are much more abundant than they used to be. Part of that is warmer winters, and part of it is these invasive fruiting shrubs that they take advantage of. That, however, is not a good reason for keeping buckthorn and honeysuckle in their forest preserves or national lake shores or whatever. So these are the two big issues, and I mean, it's really interesting. I've watched in the Calumet area over the last 20 years, buckthorn invading what were basically open woodlands 20 years ago. If they're not under management, they're buckthorn choked. Okay, so let's talk about breeding marsh birds in Calumet. Are we doing on time? I don't know. So talk about the history of decline, and we've had a rapid decline over the last century, or last decade, and then we'll talk about what the main issues are. So this is a really useless slide, but it's up here because it's got something from Birds of Illinois and Wisconsin. This was written in 1909, talking about Yellowheaded Blackbird. That's this bird here. This is a tag from a specimen at the Field Museum of a skeleton, or a nestling that was taken in South Chicago in 1883. The habitat is given as wild rice, which is not a habitat that currently occurs in this area. I don't know if it really was wild rice, but it's essentially talking about probably a diverse marsh habitat, and even our best marshes here are no longer diverse. So this goes back to the late 1800s. What this says is this species was once abundant in the vicinity of Chicago, about Calumet Lake, and is still not uncommon in that locality. Okay, so even by the early 1900s, there were declines going on in this bird that is now effectively extinct in the Calumet area, or extirpated in the Calumet area. So this decline is not something new. It's something that's been ongoing because of how much we've changed this region. Okay, we've seen these threatened birds before. It's the same set of threatened birds, just reminding us of who we're talking about. I've been working as part of the project that Mike mentioned earlier, being headed by Audubon Great Lakes, and I have to say Nat Miller is doing a fabulous job on this. I give him a huge amount of credit. We've been monitoring wetland breeding birds in 2015 just in Illinois, and in 2016 in both Indiana and Illinois, to look at what is out there, and the answer is very little right now. We're looking to characterize how much potential there is for hemi-marsh in these wetlands. And to a bird person, when you say hemi-marsh, it tells you something. Probably to most of you, it tells you nothing. But essentially, hemi-marsh is a situation where you have open water and marsh vegetation interspersed. Okay, and those are the conditions that are best for marsh breeding birds. They take advantage, they like to have things standing out in the water with open water around it. If it gets too dense, they stop using it. If it becomes too open, they stop using it. So we're looking at what we potentially can do at the different wetlands in the Calumet region going forward. We've also estimated population goals, so how many of each of these species we can get. And we've chosen least bitter, piebald green, and common gallinule as things that are important from a conservation standpoint and that respond well to creating these hemi-marsh conditions. So looking at the data here, so when I call it historical, it's actually since about 1980. And this gives you the numbers of pairs maximum any particular year since then, and most of these are from the early to mid 80s. What we had this year, which is actually a huge improvement. So this is just Illinois. Sorry. The Indiana stuff is sort of following behind, but it's a year behind. What we had this year is a big improvement over what we had 2 years ago when there were none of any of these species in any of the wetlands in Illinois. Piebald grebe is one of the most quickly responsive species I've ever seen. You create appropriate conditions and they get back immediately. So we have set goals for these species in these Illinois populations, and the numbers are not huge thinking globally, but it's an important part thinking in the upper Midwest, and we sort of see this as a model for doing similar work all through this region, not just the Calumet region, but all through northern Illinois, Wisconsin, up into Michigan. The other thing is, so we focused on those 3 species, but there are a number of other species that we expect to benefit. And some of these are things, so Bluewinged Teal is something that I haven't seen them in the summer for 3 or 4 years now. They used to be regular breeders at a number of sites. Coots have virtually vanished, but this year they bred for the first time in a couple of years on the Chicago side. When I say vanished, there's still a lot of coots, but there is migrants. I'm talking about breeding populations. Yeah.
Quick question, blue-winged teal, is that a duck?
Yes.
I just saw them this week.
Yeah, they're migrating right now.
Oh, maybe that's it. Yeah, I was out at, Mike and I were down at Orland Grassland, there was a bunch of them.
Yeah, and there are species that, so there are studies showing how much these wetland birds have declined in the upper or middle Midwest, and Bluewinged Teal is actually one of the fastest declining at that sort of scale as a breeder. But during migration, we still get big numbers coming through. King rail, well, hope for Stora and Virginia rail are ones that really respond well to creation of hemi-marsh conditions. Marsh wren is one that has held on much better than any of these others, but it likes the hemi-marsh the best. The Yellowheaded Blackbird, as I was talking about earlier, we're down to basically one bird. This is a species where we're very much at the southeastern corner of their range. They've disappeared from a whole bunch of sites in Illinois. There's only one place left in Indiana. I think it's probably too late. I hope I'm proven wrong, but I think we probably already lost that. And with that, I am finished and can take any questions. Yeah.
You showed the graph of the bluebird and the Christmas counts, and they really spiked a couple of years ago, but the following year it was back down again. What's happening since then?
So that date is actually 2006. The numbers have continued to go up. It's always bouncy, and it is very susceptible to cold weather. And so I'd have to look for sure, but my bet is that 2007 was cold early, so it dropped the numbers early in the season, so it showed up on the Christmas count. But if you go, the numbers have continued to increase through that period overall. Yeah.
I know your focus today has been on birds, but could you please say a little more about the bees? They came out funny. You mentioned that the honeybees are, we're very concerned about the colony collapse disease that's affecting honeybees. is colony collapse syndrome affecting other bee populations?
So what I would say is happening, and we don't have as good information on what's happening with the native bees as we do honeybees. But there are definitely declines in a lot of native bees, and they are probably more important than honeybees as pollinators in natural systems. They're probably less important in agricultural systems, in part because you don't take a bunch of leafcutter bees and put them out in an orchard, but you do that with honeybees. So I would say the colony collapse is something that we still don't have a good handle on exactly what the aspects are with honeybees. It's not, because the honeybees have the biggest colonies, they're more, that issue is a bigger one for them. The problem with native bees is loss of habitat, and I think the pesticide issue is important for honeybees. I think it's probably more important to the native bees, which seem to be more sensitive. And some of these native bees are actually much more effective as pollinators than honeybees. And part of it is honeybees have special things on their legs to store the pollen. A lot of the native bees don't, so they get pollen all over the place, and then when they go to the next flower, they're very good at pollinating, while honeybees, they've got all that pollen, but it's stored someplace where it doesn't pollinate it as well. It's hard to get people excited about native bees because there are a huge number of species, but most of them, I look out in my yard and I see honeybees, I see bumblebees, and there are native ones and non-native ones, but bumblebees are very important too. And then there are all these little bees, and God knows what they are. But most of them are native. And one group that I only learned about a couple of years ago is the leafcutter bees, which are really good quality pollinators and are an important component in that environment. And the leafcutter bees they nest in sort of small cavities, so you can put out, like what my wife does, is she puts out the old stems from goldenrods from our yard in kind of a bundle, and the leafcutter bees will nest in there, and the leaf cutting is to create what essentially lines the capsule that they develop in. So there are a lot of cool bees out there, and it's something that for our ecosystems, they're much more important than honeybees on a lot of species that need pollinators. So. Yeah.
I think it was 2 years ago, there was a big marsh tour, and there were pelicans.
Yeah.
Is that a major aberration, or can we expect?
So pelicans are moving this way. They've become more common farther east than their breeding ground, and so we're seeing more in the Chicago area. It's still an aberration, but I saw my first pelican at Wolf Lake, late 90s, and since then I've seen them occasionally in the Calumet region, but it's something they used to not be here at all, and we're seeing them. They're still more abundant west of Chicago, but they're definitely becoming more regular in Chicago and even into northwestern Indiana. And it's related to the fact their population is increasing, and it's increasing at the eastern edge of their range. They just started nesting in Illinois for the first time 2 years ago. So it's something you should expect to see more of, but it will still be patchy here at the beginning. Yeah.
Years ago, if my memory serves me correctly, when we would drive through the region, especially down 41, things like that, we would see a lot of, as we came, Calumet, I'm sorry, coming down Calumet, black-crowned night herons, I think, and now we see egrets. We don't see black-crowned night herons. Is that just a normal fluctuation in species, or in variations within the species, or are we going through a big change here?
We're going through a big change here. Egrets are increasing and are doing pretty well. Black-crowned night herons are doing poorly. So you're seeing a shift in the dominant species of herons. I mean, one of the things that's happened over the last 5 years is great blue heron, which never bred on the Illinois side of Calumet, are now breeding there. So great blues and great egrets are doing well. Black-crowned night heron is doing poorly. There are a variety of things at play in that. One of the things is black-crowned night herons nest lower to the ground and like it dense. And I hate to demonize cormorants, but cormorants are part of the problem here. When they get into these heron rookeries, there's something about cormorant poop that is really, really noxious, and it fairly rapidly kills the vegetation in a way that doesn't happen as quickly with the other herons. It takes much longer. So when it does that, it no longer is appropriate for black-crowned night herons. The other thing is that the great egrets and the great blues can live a long time nesting in trees that are dead, but the black-crowned night herons won't do that. So there are a variety of things in play there. In terms of feeding, I suspect there are differences in what they feed on. I mean, the fact that the egrets and herons, one of the things that they like are zebra mussels, because the clear water column makes it easier for them to find food. Black-crowned night herons, which are active at night, do most of their foraging at night. It plays less of an issue. They're not so much visual feeders at depth the way the other herons are. They're fishing on things that are right at the surface. So there are a lot of things that play there, but what you're seeing is not a random thing. It's something that's happening throughout the region. Yeah.
Are these hurricanes and floods and stuff like that that's been happening down south and out in the central part of the country, is that causing the birds and stuff to come back up this way too?
I don't know the answer to that. So for things like herons, the changes in what's happening farther south, where the biggest populations are, may be playing a role in what we see here. It's probably mostly negative. So things like so if you get flooding during the breeding season, you'll lose an entire colony. And when you lose that colony, then in the fall, when we would get young birds coming north, we don't get them anymore. We see it, for example, I didn't mention little blue, but little blue heron is a threatened species in Illinois. It's not threatened in Indiana, but it's rare in Indiana as a breeder. It started breeding in Calumet in the 90s and bred for 4 or 5 years in the heron rookeries there. As the heron rookeries broke up, they stopped doing it, but the other thing that's happened now is we don't even get them in the fall the way we did. And that's because of the populations south of us have declined. The inland populations in southern Illinois, southern Indiana, Missouri, western Kentucky, those populations have all gone down, and most of that's related to water levels being wrong. Some of it's related to loss of habitat, but mostly the water levels there have played a role. And so the flooding, and we see these issues with water levels that play just havoc on the birds along the Gulf Coast, and I think those are probably the source for a lot of our birds. So I think what's going is the opposite way. The flooding, the hurricanes have a negative effect on the birds here because our source populations are drying up.
You mentioned the decline in the breeding of the marsh waterfowl. Is there any correlation to the abundance of mute swans, territorial?
That's a good question that I don't know that I can answer. The mute swans are definitely a negative for marsh breeding waterfowl. There are two things. They're very aggressive, and they also eat an unbelievable amount of food. And so they have been demonstrated to affect the breeding of other species of waterfowl in other areas. Where it's most important is in small wetlands. You know, big wetlands, a few mute swan make a little difference, but in a little wetland, a pair of mute swans can make a big difference. And what we've got in this region are these little wetlands. They each now have their pair of mute swans. It's nesting every year, and it's a potential issue. I don't think anybody's really looked at it in detail here, but it's definitely an issue. In Illinois, there are attempts to start a program of controlling mute swans, but the state DNR has not agreed to it yet, because it's one of those things. Swans have a constituency. People like swans. I like mute swans too, but they don't really belong in our fragile wetlands. Yeah.
The area around 87th Street and the lake in South Chicago is an area that a lot of people still have not yet discovered. However, we were over there not that long ago, and there was a policeman sitting in the car, and he says Audubon people come over here all the time. I thought, gee, that's kind of interesting. So would you see that birding might be a viable sort of tourist industry here, and if so, like where and when?
That's an interesting question, and my guess is that it's probably not going to be a huge tourist industry, because we're in the middle of the country. We don't have things that are just hugely special that you can't get other places. So the Dunes now has a birding festival in the spring that they're starting, and it's sort of modeled on some other ones. The thing they've got is a really impressive spring migration. If conditions are right, it can be really spectacular, and it can rival places like Point Pelee, and definitely you can get bird tourists to see that kind of thing. We'll see how that plays out. I think as a general thing, it's going to be tough. I think the Dunes probably has the best opportunity. The conditions there are much nicer. If there aren't birds, it's still a cool place to go. It's a little harder to sell people on Bovian Woods if it's not full of birds. And so we'll sort of have to see. I mean, it is something people have been looking at. I think there are problems in Calumet. I mean, I have a really terrible sense of smell, so it doesn't bother me. But I take people down to Big Marsh and Dead Stick Pond and so on, and all they can talk about is how it smells. And we talk about my tour of the smells of the southeast side of Chicago, and I don't even notice them. But those kinds of things, actually, there is actually a study's been done looking at that, and it does. There are people that's a strong negative for that kind of thing. I find the kind of juxtaposition of old steel mills and wetlands to be pretty cool. There are people that see that, and all they see is how ugly it looks. So, there are some things that will have to be kind of worked out. But that it's Calumet shows up in things like the best 100 places in North America for birds. And so it does have a certain reputation that's positive, and it's got a certain reputation that's less positive. Yeah.
I have a question. Would you consider Acreage Woods as a endemic marsh? The ponds?
Yeah, when it was right, yes. It's not been right for a while,
No.
and part of that, so Field Museum's been involved in restoration work there, and they've gotten rid of the Phragmites, and it's better than it was. But the water levels are too high, and basically because the hydrology is so screwed up. It used to drain south into Wolf Lake. Now there's a slag field there, and then the water control structure at the north end that used to do something is broken. So it's basically a bathtub that fills up.
Yeah. 20 years ago, we were talking about, or less than 15, about restoring the natural flow, drainage from Eggerswood back into Wolf Lake. And that would mean chopping through the slide
Yeah,
fields.
it's not a realistic
And
thing. I don't think.
feasibility of it would,
Yeah.
so what is the
So
current thing?
so what they're working on, so the forest, so we did the kind of vegetation restoration, which has helped. Forest Preserve District has done a hydrological study, and they now actually are looking for money to do a water control structure that will give access back out to what was the case for about 30 years to a drain that goes out at the north end at 112. And so if we can fix that, then we can get control of the water level, and we're not at the mercy of rains and drought. And it may be a little bit of hubris to think we can do a better job of controlling the water level than is done naturally, but it's not natural. So and one of the things with what's happened in the Calumet is all of these wetlands used to be connected, and now they're isolated pieces. And that really makes it difficult to sort of rely on nature to do it, because we've totally disrupted that.
Has there been any discussion of reconnecting them?
I've heard it mentioned, and essentially the immediate problem is the cost, which would be on the order of millions.
Right.
The other issue is going through that slag, you would open it up to all the crap that's in the slag
Yeah.
that right now is essentially inactive.
Yeah. You almost have to go around it.
Yeah,
And not through it.
It's just not a realistic thing to do.
Okay.
So, yeah, I don't think that's the route we would be able to go.
And then my last question is, how long have they known that Eurasian milfoil was in Eggerswood?
I'm not sure if they've known. So I work with the Wetlands Initiative, and Wetlands Initiative is one of the partners in the Pelican Great Lakes thing. So I work with Wetlands Initiative at a place called Pelican out in the Illinois River, and it was a great wetland. And then suddenly Eurasian milfoil got in there, and it got bad, and so we had to do some control on it. I learned what Eurasian milfoil looked like. And next time I went to Hennepin, I looked in the water and thought, this is full of Eurasian milfoil.
You got to keep, even though you make a treatment of it one year, you got to keep coming back. And
Yeah, so with Eurasian milfoil, the thing with eggers, because boats don't go in there, I think it probably would be something where if you got rid of it,
it would
it would stay on for a while. It probably would eventually get back because these things are good at it. But the big issue in most lakes is boats transporting in between places. They try to blame it on birds, but it's boats.
No, I know
a big
it's
issue.
boats.
So, I'm not sure it's something anybody's focused on because there's so many issues at eggers, but that is something that if we get other things worked out, we're going to come to terms with milfoil.
But also that's a kind of a small area, and you do have your swans there, so that they probably control everything.
Yeah.
Is the Field Museum doing type of work along where old U.S. Steel used to be?
So when you
South
say
Chicago?
U.S. Steel, where are you talking about?
Well, over in
87th
South
Street.
Chicago.
South Chicago, okay.
87th.
So we're not really involved there except sort of casually. Park District now has control of some of that land, and they're working on a plan for that, and I have provided some input there, but we're not really strongly involved in that area. If it were up to me, a lot more of that would end up being parkland, but the city really wants to have development in there. So I think less of it than would be ideal will end up being natural landscape. More of it will be housing development or something. We'll see. The first developer has pulled out, so we'll see what. It's
I mean, we've tried, and development, you just can't, we wanted the wide edge along the the shoreline, and they kept saying, no, 100 feet, and we would say, no, 1,000 feet.
Yeah.
But it's down to probably 100 feet. Yeah. And it's not that we haven't tried, it's just
Right.
the locals are kind of overwhelmed by loop personalities.
Yeah.
But
I have a question.
Yeah.
I'm looking at the pictures here of the swans and look like they were not indigenous to the area.
Right.
So do we gain some and lose some? I mean, is it,
So, I mean, the answer to that is a little bit of yes. The question is what you're actually looking for. So I'm going to talk about fish, who I know almost nothing about. But long-term studies have been done on the fish populations in Wolf Lake. And basically, the diversity is effectively unchanged from the late 1800s. But what's happened is the native fish fauna has, a lot of it has gone away, and it's been replaced by non-natives and natives that are kind of trash fish. And so you've lost kind of high-quality stuff and replaced it with widespread common things. The diversity hasn't changed much. There are some issues in terms of the kind of ecological roles that are being filled, and you've lost some of the specialty things that are doing very particular things and replaced them with things that are doing pretty much the same thing everybody else is doing. So I think you've probably lost some ecosystem function there. My take on that is that's a bad thing. It's not as bad as going from 50 species to 2, which has happened in some places where you've lost all that diversity, but it's not as good as maintaining that native diversity and all the ecological roles that they're done. With birds, it's sort of the same thing. You know, they're in places that are partially disturbed. That's where you get the highest diversity typically. But that diversity that comes in and gives you that high diversity tends to be widespread weedy species instead of relatively conservative species that are potentially of conservation interest. And again, you know, I think that's a negative. So.
any more questions? We're approaching, we usually go, no matter how we plan it, we usually go until about 6:15 every time. So this is the perfect time. I just, is there any announcements to be made? I made some at the beginning. If not, I just want to remind everybody that the speaker next month will be Dirk Anderson from Open Lands, which is an agency in Chicago, not for profit. And he'll be talking, and he's done a lot of work in Northwest Indiana and Southeast Chicago. So he'll be talking about green connections and water connections. And if there's not any other questions, I just want to thank everybody for coming and remind those that are planning on going to the research summit that it starts at 9 in the morning. And actually, you should get there a little bit before 9. But we'll see you there. Thank you, everybody.
Security guy.